if you were an avid listener of the podcast, which I like to think you all are, you likely heard my conversation recently with Alexandra Deutsch, who is the director of collections for Winterthur Museum, Garden, and Library. That conversation was fascinating, but we dove into the background of H.F. DuPont, Winterthur's founder, and all about his design philosophy, his collecting philosophy, and how the estate has really grown into what it's known for today. Consider today's conversation something of a part two. We are talking about DuPont and Winterthur again, but from the lens of the outdoors, because his inspiration that he pulled from his environment was so strong that it warranted its own conversation. In fact, it warranted its own exhibit at the museum. So settle in. This is another fascinating conversation where we talk all things outdoors and the influence that it had on the interiors of the estate. I hope you enjoy. Welcome to Grandma's Silver, where tradition meets today. I'm Allie, your host of the Grandma Silver podcast and founder of the Grand Millennial Lifestyle. Here, we blend aesthetics with nostalgia, engaging in conversations with lifestyle brands, designers, and more to rediscover the timeless charm of the past. Join me as we journey from home to heart, illuminating the past and polishing the present with the gleam of Grandma Silver. Alexandra, welcome back to Grandma Silver.
Great to talk to you again.
So for those who maybe didn't see episode 1 on our roster, I will link to it in our show notes and just preface this by saying that we are kind of diving into some of the interiors and HF's correlation and connection to the gardens, the outdoors, the landscape. This is almost like a part 2, if you will, with a slightly different focus. But if you're interested in any of the background and who HF even is, what Winterthur even is, we'll direct you to that episode. And of course, Alexandra was kind enough to be our guest on that one. So we're talking part 2, but if you don't mind, could you just, for those who need a refresher, tell people who you are and what your role is?
Sure. I'm Alexandra Deutsch, and I'm the John L. and Marjorie P. McGraw Director of Collections at Winterthur, which means that I am fortunate enough to oversee the museum departments and then also our team that does interpretation and engagement. So that's our public programming and all the experiences on the estate that the visitors might have.
You know, one of the things that we briefly touched on in our last conversation that also sort of sparked some excitement, I think, to have this conversation is the fact that I was even personally fascinated to learn that HF really didn't have a technical design background. He actually started it, correct me if I'm not remembering this right, but horticulture.
He did. So he is never a good student, even though he goes to Groton, which is a prestigious boarding school. That was really based on tradition. And then he goes to Harvard. And it is interesting because he goes to Harvard at a time that just at, the turn of the 20th century when financially they are struggling. It's hard to imagine Harvard struggling. So he does end up at Harvard, and he takes the regular battery of courses, which is pretty painful for him, getting C's and struggling in philosophy and things. But he does latch onto horticulture and really this study of the science of horticulture. That becomes, later in as his life evolves, his great passion is horticulture and actually agriculture too, which he goes on to eventually create a really important herd and dairy on the Winterthur estate. So yes, so he has training in that. But in terms of design, I think what we've increasingly realized is that the aesthetics of the garden are what begin to really shape him as a collector. I think that perspective that we've now gained about him and his background in horticulture and how that manifests through design is something we are exploring more and more. And I think it's such a fascinating thread about his evolution.
You're touching on something important because, when I talk to interior designers, which is frequently, one of the things I love asking them is what some of their personal motivations and inspirations are behind their overall aesthetic. Of course, being an interior designer, there's a lot of client-led direction there, but they have a feel that generally their clients are attracted to. Would you say, because design came later for him, maybe it sounds kind of that way. Maybe he, kind of was part of that world before he connected those dots himself. But how would you say the garden, the landscape, horticulture, agriculture influenced or inspired him? And are there particular ways you're aware of that shows up in his work, I guess is what I'm asking.
Yes, and I think you really have to look at his childhood to understand this drive to gather things, right? And at first he's in the landscape of Winterthur. As a child, he's not very athletic, he's introverted. He has a very domineering father who had had a military career and then a political career. And so HF would take to the land. And a lot of that involved gathering things, natural elements in the land, whether it was flowers or whether it was rocks. I would say that through that and just seeing, for instance, this beautiful card he makes for his mother where he takes bark and he strips it from a tree, or maybe it had fallen off the tree, and then he creates this beautiful note for her on it. I would say that his impulse to design was something innate in him. It doesn't manifest in interiors for until he's older. But even when we look at his room as a very young man, at one point they move out of the family moves out of the main house of Winterthur and over to another building on the estate just temporarily for, I guess, renovations. And you see a wasp's nest hung above his mantle, and you see just this collection of ephemera and objects and things from nature. And you can see that he's a designer in it. It's so much more than just like, I've taken a specimen that I found outside and I'm putting it on a shelf. But he's always got that sensibility about him. And I think it is hard to really define when that officially starts, because I don't really think it officially just starts until he becomes more of a public figure around his collecting, and Winterthur starts getting promoted. The interiors of Winterthur start getting promoted in a bigger national context. But I think he's always designing, even at these very early ages in his life.
I think you also are, within that talking about some of that anecdotal information, the bark in particular. I think it takes a certain creative mind to literally look at the world around you and see it differently, to look at something like bark and see a different purpose for it or see the beauty in it and want to utilize it. That is the design mentality.
Absolutely. And one of the things he did even as a boy was gifting flowers. So this idea of gathering, of collecting, of gifting things that are really beautiful, that have a human touch to them. I mean, he's a child of the 19th century, so I think that's a different era. People weren't going to shops necessarily to buy gifts, to buy cards the way we do today. But I do think that is, arguably is where he begins as both a designer and as a collector. And I think increasingly we see that when we look at his childhood.
When I think about the interiors, and we've talked about 175 rooms
Yes.
within Winter, so massive estate. There are windows and beautiful views. I mean, within each room, there is so much to see, but he really, I think, and I've heard different people talk about it in different ways, but I do feel like the landscape both influenced, and we can talk about really specifically colors and the visual of the room, the design of a room, but also the view.
Absolutely.
Because there's so many windows, there's loads of windows, lots of natural light. You can tell that it was intentional, I think, the way your eye is drawn to a particular view, especially because sometimes it's looking at architectural details that are outside, it's looking at gardens, and then you can tell the dynamic between the indoor and the outdoor space. So I would love to hear, I don't know if you are aware of if there are certain rooms where that is really something that was a mindful effort.
I think no question it was a mindful effort as he is beginning to evolve Winterthur, and especially once his father passes away and he has a
Mm.
lot even greater aesthetic control. I think nothing to me embodies it more than the fact that when you arrived at Winterthur during HF's period of living there, you would come into a hall, and that beautiful hall, it is circular drive. You would pull up and the front door would open, but the door at the end of the hallway would be open, and that looks off to the East Terrace, and you see beautiful lawn and you see the outside, but you would walk through or walk into this long hallway that had tones of green and Chinese wallpaper with birds and flowers. And so this blurring of the outside and inside. So you had come from a garden view on the west side, and then you're coming through, and then you're looking out through the other open door at the other terrace, the East Terrace, where then you're seeing more green and beauty. And this time of year, we have little Tommies, these little lilac flowers, pale purple flowers that pop up all over that lawn. And I think all of that is very intentional. And that also he is bringing all these blooms into the house. So you have interior to these spaces where it's the blooms that have come from the cutting garden. There was a 3-acre cutting garden that the estate, these have been grown on the estate. And then he's bringing those from the land into the house in these big clusters, because his aesthetic was to cluster the same variety together, not the kind of arrangements we think of with multiple varieties. So this blurring is very intentional. I think you see that in the hall. I think you see it in so many rooms. A wonderful bedroom where you can peek out and you'll see this trellised kind of gazebo in the garden, and then there are design elements in the room that mirror that shape. That connectivity, I think, is entirely intentional on his part.
We talked a little bit about, we'll call it his design philosophy, but sort of the approach that he often took, particularly because, and we dove into how he collected, the extent of his collections, even at the time. He really was designing the outdoor and the indoor. There was such a duality there that I didn't realize until you were kind of talking about this, that, even with wanting the doors open, it's part of the experience of the space. Because again, I was so enthralled with how he was collecting and like what he was collecting and the strategy there. I mean, some of it was more that he knew, the collection as a whole would be more complete with, XYZ included. But when it comes to integrating the collections into the design, did the exterior play a role in that as well? If he was taking such care to think about the outdoor and the landscape in his work?
I think that there's no question that actually, I feel like in some cases, the outside shaped his aesthetics for the decisions on the inside. So this love of taking one variety of a planting, whether it's in the garden or it's how he then brings blooms into the house, but this color blocking, you'll see in the landscape. And
Okay.
then when you go into the house, for instance, he had a huge collection of transfer printed ceramics. So those kind of graphic 19th century, people might think of blue willow as a familiar pattern. But they're very graphic, and they have floral elements, and these transfer printed wares come in blue and roses and purples. And what he then does in the house is he will have a whole cabinet of blue. And
Mm.
it really mirrors, if you think about a whole swath of blue blooms in the garden. So I think one thing that we started to see when we put this lens on is that the outside shapes his thinking about the inside. But I think it is hard to say where chicken and egg, is
Right.
it that he develops this very particular aesthetic for the outside? Does he develop that earlier? I can't really parse that. I think maybe as we evolve our thinking on this, we may be able to more definitively pinpoint that thinking.
Okay.
But I do think it is difficult to argue against it, because when you are in the house and you look out the window, which I always tell people, look out the windows, and you begin to see this correlation, this sympathetic color schemes and design elements between the outside and the inside, to me, there's a seamlessness that you start to see in an overall aesthetic where one is inextricably linked to the other.
It's really interesting too, because of course, with it being such a large property, the view changes quite a bit.
Mhm.
But it is interesting that each room, and I would say that many, if not most, have a window.
A lot do. When he expands the house in the 30s, and he now is going to increase it to being the 175 room mansion that it is today, there are rooms built underground. There, I think, because again, this goes into the landscape. In order to really respect the landscape of Winterthur, which is a multi-generational tradition, is there's every generation really preserved the contours of the land in a way that's really unusual. What that ends up doing is ending up with rooms underground. Now, some of them have false windows that
Okay.
it appears that you're above ground. But yes, I'd say, the majority of floors you have windows. It's more there are certainly, I've never counted up the rooms that don't have windows, but those rooms tend to be rooms that are more intended once he's expanding to be a museum.
Even if you're just on one floor, you're very much looking at just different angles of the same garden or the same space. It is incredible the way the space is designed to highlight that exact angle and
Mhm.
exactly what the eye would see or be drawn to. I find that so interesting. And so, frankly, the amount of work that has to go into doing that is incredible.
And I think that's very classic HF DuPont, that sort of rigorous aesthetic control that it
Hmm.
takes to decision make around that. And there's a great story when and I think I talked about this before on the podcast, but when he realizes that he decides that they're going to build a visitors pavilion, he actually has I guess his title was, I don't know, chief curator, deputy director, or I don't know what Charles Montgomery's title was. The story goes, as I've heard it, that he literally goes out to the site and he makes Montgomery, like, if the building is here, what would you see? If the building is here, how would it look? And he's even situating a building in such a way
Wow.
that it has what would you see as you came down the hill if the building was here? And it's really interesting because, now as we even tackle projects on the estate, thinking about view shed, which is, to me, I don't know a term used in that period, but how thoughtful he always was, right? About
Mhm.
not only what you're seeing, but as you move in a space, where is your eye going to go, whether it's within the room or it's outside, so if you're in this window, when you're in this bedroom I'm speaking of, and you have this alignment between a view that has this trellising in the garden, but then you sort of see the slope of that roof, and then you see it mirrored in a bird cage that hangs in the window typically. And you have to think that's not happenstance, because it's throughout the house. So that, to me, that rigorous control of aesthetics is a very HF DuPont signature of
It's,
his personality too, right? I
yeah.
mean, his aesthetic and his personality.
You touched on a couple of things which got me thinking about, and you might not have the answer to this, but I'm just thinking the fact that the view played such a strong role in the interior design of the space and even in the collections of the space, and understanding this region experiences 4 seasons,
Yes.
how does that impact? Because surely he's not looking at the view and saying, this is exclusively interesting in summer.
Yes, no. So I think where you really see this is that he created seasonal changes for the textiles in the rooms.
Oh,
So he would have
interesting.
4 to 5 sets of draperies for a room and slipcovers. And I mean, sometimes rugs would change. So he definitely thought about what was going to be seasonally changed in the rooms. And there is a sympathetic relationship, I think, to some of that decision making about what was coming in. I also think he's building on more of a tradition he had certainly grown up with that you saw in the 19th century of, and even before, of with the seasons you would change the slipcovers, put
Mhm.
slipcovers on your upholstered furniture, change your drapes to lighten it up with as the seasons changed, as it got warmer or colder. But he takes it to a whole new level. And so when you look at window hangings, bed hangings, slipcovers in our collection, they actually are numbered and they correlate to the season. And all those records, for the most part, we can retrace. So yes, I think that the intentionality of it being a four-season state, he also, I think, is impacted by the fact, although the garden is beautiful at all times, and always there's something blooming or something to see in the garden. There's an evolution in the garden throughout the four seasons because the family lived in four different residences.
Mhm.
And they are there in the spring, and they're there then in the holiday season, the sort of late fall into the holiday season. Not to say that there aren't times that they're at the house outside of those seasons, but the real thrusts of the gardens and the changes in the gardens are also cued to the high points of when they're at the house. But that sort of connectivity with the seasons, I think you 100% see in really how he designs the spaces of the house, even thinking forward throughout the year, how they'll change.
Now, are you all rotating any of the textiles
We
today?
were we rotate a bit. We just don't have the staff,
Yeah.
to rotate. And also it's very hard on the textiles to rotate. But we do rotations, but not to the extent that he did. And I don't even know in the days after his death that they ever could maintain all of those rotations. Also, as a museum, I feel that even when it transitions from private home to museum and you don't have weekend visitors and other things, I would imagine that things were tapering off in these
Mhm.
rotations. I mean, 4 to 5 changes a year is a lot
It
for.
is. And it is also, if we're talking about preservation, which we did quite a bit last time, I'm sure it comes up again today, right? But
Yes.
if we're talking about conserving
Yes.
and the conservation and preservation of materials and objects, like you just mentioned, that makes sense. Now, you did talk about the cut flowers. So I was going to ask about that later, but I think why not talk about it now?
Sure.
So that was something he was really focused on, was how to literally bring, and we'll talk about, I mean, no pun intended, but how to bring the outside in. We'll talk about the significance of that phrase in a little while, but that was something that I really don't hear tons of designers talking about,
Mm,
is how to utilize your landscape to further brighten
mhm,
or to further accentuate your interiors.
mhm.
Is that something that you feel comfortable speaking to?
Sure. The presence of flowers is so important at Winterthur. It's actually a tradition we maintain. And so within the collections interpretation division, we have a whole team, our floral team, with designers and the incredibly creative staff who still create these arrangements in the house, even though now sometimes there'll be arrangements that are very true to the HF aesthetic. Other times they're historically inspired by other influences, and sometimes they're just modern and experimental and absolutely incredible. So we've never lost that tradition. So for him, he would meet each week with his gardener to determine the best blooms and really plan out what is going to come into the rooms. A lot of that was determined by what were the best blooms. And then if it was a table, thinking about what tablescaping he would do, what service he would use that would aesthetically work with those blooms. So this is a big part of the rhythm of when he's at Winterthur, when he's in residence, this meeting with the gardener, picking the blooms, figuring out what rooms those will be in. It was a seamless part of how he lived in the interiors and how he created these environments by bringing these arrangements into the spaces in a way that complemented also what the design of the interior was. So I think it's really interesting. And what it reminds me a lot of is actually the designer Athena Calderon, who is always going into her garden and she'll cut a whole branch and put it in a vase. And hers is a little more of a wild aesthetic, but the same sensibility of going outside into your landscape and bringing things in and using that as a design element as you would a vase or as you would a chair or as you would a accessory in a room or a pillow. It's the same treatment in a way that I think you do see some designers who are really embracing, but that was how HF, that there was some inextricable link between the natural elements he would bring in a room and the physical material objects of the room. I mean, I don't want to say, I would say almost they're all seamlessly integrated, right? It's
Yeah.
all part of the whole.
I love that you brought up the tablescapes because that was something we very briefly touched on last time. As you're saying it, I was just kind of thinking to myself, being a former event planner and event design, that was something that was constant part of my day. And I often talk to folks about entertaining and how to, if that's not really your niche, different ways people like to approach that. And so many say that they're inspired by a linen and they'll start with a linen or they'll start with their tableware. Many florists might say they start with their centerpiece, but I love that he really just started outside.
He did.
And admittedly, he likely had way more resources than the average entertainer today. He had so many different sets of dinnerware, so many probably different linens and that
Yes.
sort of thing that he could afford to do that kind of a thing. But I love the idea of stepping outside of your comfort zone and having that creative challenge of let's start outdoors
Mhm.
and see what we can do from there.
Yeah, to me, I think that is really inspiring. I think that's a takeaway just personally for me, but I think it has been a takeaway for visitors
Mm.
too, is um, actually start outside,
Yeah.
start in natural elements. And I think it just it's a different aesthetic approach, but in some ways it's to me the more creative approach and allows for more variety. I think, in how you tablescape too.
Hmm.
I will say that since I've been back and we've been doing all this work, I'm lucky enough to have moved to a house that had a really beautiful established garden that has a lot of blooms. And when, because of HF, because of seeing this and learning more about how he did this, I've never forgot my first season here. It was like, oh yeah, I'm going to see what's blooming. And then I'm going to go out and cut things and then I'm going to figure out what I'm serving
Hmm.
sometimes, and letting that dictate it. So I do think for people looking for how do you bring a little bit of Winterthur to your home, maybe it is, and maybe it isn't your garden, maybe it's just going to wherever you get your flowers and saying, oh, I love these tulips, and then you think, okay, well, how am I going to integrate them into my table,
Yeah.
as opposed to starting the kind of reverse, like this is my tablecloth, what am I gonna put on?
Right. Yeah, that's what I mean. I feel like the creative challenge is so, if you are someone who enjoys being creatively challenged, I think it allows you to have fun in a really, like you said, almost a backwards approach,
Hmm.
because it is actually quite rare that you would start that way and almost force yourself to figure out, okay, like what colors could work with this? Because nature, I mean, the colors of flowers vary so drastically. Even the colors of, we're talking about, you mentioned tulips.
Hmm.
That could vary so drastically. There could
Yeah.
be flecks of orange in a pink tulip. There could be, I mean, the color palette can kind of be all over the spectrum. So I think it's really fun to be able to even pull some like one color from something or just see how they play together. And if you are someone who is, really enjoys that artistic,
Hmm.
doing all of that kind of thing, I think that sounds like so much fun.
I also think his philosophy, which is to me, I've never thought about this till I got to know Winterthur, is now I think so many people strive is like, oh, well, what flowers go with what flowers? I mean, with tulips, sometimes you just do the tulips, but this idea of taking a wonderful bloom or a wonderful cutting, and that's what the focus is, right? It doesn't get integrated into other things, and that in of itself is a takeaway that I think is very applicable in your own home and how you think about shaping the aesthetics of your table
Yeah.
too.
Now, speaking of our homes, but also in particular the incredible spaces within the estate, are there, you mentioned the hall as being one, but are there any that and it sounds like most have some sort of inspiration from the outside, but are there any in particular that you think the color palettes or even the patterns or the texture were really landscape inspired?
I would say I love to think about that in the DuPont dining room, where you
Mm.
have sort of pale yellow walls, and you have pinks and greens. And throughout the seasons, because you have windows on both sides of that big room, and this is on the self-guided tour for people who come, so they can see it. But you see the garden on both sides. And that is a room that in every season, I mean, I remember last fall looking out the window, and one of the trees outside had just burst into incredible yellow leaves, and how that changed how the green and pink in the room popped, how the walls became a little less vivid in a way, and but everything became elevated, because if you looked out the window and you saw this really dense bright yellow, and it does make me wonder, as I see things like that. I'm sure he looked out that window. I'm sure he thought about that tree. He knew that when that turned, the leaves would be yellow. And that's a room I love to think about in relation to the garden. HF loved green, and so there are over 40 shades of green in the house. And I've mentioned this because I am so fascinated by this. But there's a lot of green too when you look out of the windows from that room, and these wonderful touches of not quite a grass green, but a green that really picks up the greens that you see outside too, is in that room. It's a very natural palette, this pale yellow, green,
Yeah.
sort of rosy pink palette, with touches of white. And so to me, that's a wonderful space to really think about an outside in aesthetic. And plus, of course, it's a dining room. So it's one of the epicenters where you can really see tablescaping, Winterthur style at the museum. And right now, our spring tour, which is a tradition of Winterthur's that goes back actually to HF, where we revise some things in the house, and the floral team's work for the spring tour is just incredible, and you can really see and appreciate some of these massing treatments that he did with single blooms, particularly in the DuPont dining room right now.
You mentioned something a minute ago about the pale yellow, and it got me thinking about how in many homes there will be color, but perhaps the homeowner prefers something a little more muted. And so much of the house, if not most of the house, will then be in that paler palette, pastels. What I think is really interesting, and I didn't really connect until you started talking about there being 40 shades of green. And, there is such an incredible blend without being jarring of very pale, neutral, saturated. I don't know how he pulled that off because it's not like you walk into one room where it's more pastel or paler colors, and then you walk into a bright space. You might not even realize the
Mhm.
transition of that.
I mean, there's no question every color is meticulously planned. I mean, to the point where his colors will be painted, and he'll, either someone who he's one of his key advisors, like this woman, Bertha Bankert, would say, oh no, the pink is wrong, right? They've painted it again, the pink is wrong. It's all so intentional. He also would do a lot of pre-planning. He wouldn't just say, okay, we're going to do this color, but he would map out in advance how the rooms would look, as a designer would, and then figure it out. And then if things came into spaces and they weren't the right color, he would revise and revise and revise. So I think it is very intentional. I think if you are at Winterthur and you tune into that, what I really appreciate about his design, which is intentional, is he really believed that your eyes shouldn't be jarred by any one thing. And I think you can apply that to his use of color. So
Mhm.
yes, you may go to a room that's very muted, and then you might move into a room that is more intense, but it's soft. It's never a jarring transition. You never go from one room and then you just feel sort of like, oh gosh, now I'm in radical explosion of color, which I think sometimes you see in, design now,
Yes,
where
I would
you'll
agree.
see a very neutral space and then you'll have, ooh, you'll have real intensity. It's a much softer transition. I think there's also a thoughtfulness too, because he did use a lot of scenic and patterned wallpapers throughout the house. They have an energy and vibrancy to them, but you often see them juxtaposed with a softer palette that integrates, or with a palette where, like in our Chinese parlor, which is also on the self-guided tour, where the woodwork has a very sympathetic color to the background of the wallpaper. You see that in Port Royal. So that sort of gentle transition, so that nothing is jarring, that your
Yeah.
eye can take in the whole, is really central to his design theory.
I think also what I was thinking is so many contemporary designers, and this might be what clients want, but I tend to see a lot of they wanted a fun room, right? So there's lots of neutrals, things are more muted. And then we have this really bold in your face space, and we're calling it the fun room.
Mhm.
And so that's kind of why that's why you feel like, wow. But
Yes.
I love that there are fun rooms throughout Winterthur.
Oh, yes.
You
And
just wouldn't feel it's not aggressive.
it isn't. It
Yeah.
isn't. And I love that. And I think that is also really a wonderful thing for people to come and experience. I think one thing that I've started to pay more attention to is that he will tease a color. So it'll be teased in an adjacent space. So you'll have this touch of sort of a corally pink, and then it will appear later, right? And it may not be exactly the same tone, but this sort of teasing of color that creates this, very soft rhythm that
Mhm.
I think you don't even realize you're experiencing. So you don't have the fun room like,
Yeah.
oh, wow, I've been in like beige land, with pops of sapphire blue, but now I'm in a sapphire blue lacquered room. Yeah, I mean, I think it's very sophisticated, it's very subtle.
Yes.
I think there's something to take away from that.
Absolutely. It's done. Yeah, it's done very seamlessly. This might be too specific of a question, so just let me know if it is. But because you work so closely with the collection, are there any decorative arts pieces that were specifically collected because of the inspiration of the landscape or that reminded him of home or anything like that?
I would say yes. I think that certainly his love of flowers
Mhm.
has a big influence on him. I mean, Chinese export porcelain, much of it is floral. I think his love of that, his favorite textile style or design was the palanquin, which is the tree of life, which is such an organic form. He chooses to put it in his bedroom. He collects it. So I do think he is shaped by this
Yeah.
love of the outdoors, by naturalistic elements. And, I think it is interesting to me because I would argue that this is not just an HF thing, but a multi-generational love of the land that, is translating into him in a way. I mean, he talks about the presence of the landscape and flowers at Winterthur in his childhood. So his mother loved flowers. It isn't just with him, it's just that he then manifests it in a whole all-encompassing way when he then is designing Winterthur.
As you're talking, I'm thinking about how much time he was spending outside and how much thought he put into things like florals and just very detail oriented because he was also an entertainer and there was a lot of use of property in his entertaining. Was he thinking about that at all, about like the flow of his entertaining of like we'll start outside and then we'll bring them into this specific room because of the continuity of the experience?
Yes, there's no question. I mean, it would be a fantasy to even have one night as a guest of HF
Oh,
Dupont
I know.
because I think everything was planned for you. Now we have this on the east side of the house. There was an area that was called the grotto and it's enclosed now. But, to sit on this upper terrace and be in this grotto and then process down to the reflecting pool, which is the swimming pool, and then to have cocktails around that, and then probably to, go back to your room, maybe have champagne on the east lawn. And I think that he was all constructed, right? And
Mhm.
I think what's so interesting is that he's basically I mean, even from his grandson talking to me about him and his memories of him, who's really a socially uncomfortable person. He always had been. I mean, he knew that there were expectations for
Mm.
him to be social because
Yeah.
of his wealth and the circles he was expected to travel in. And yet he's a masterful entertainer, right? He's constructing the most incredible entertainments for his guests. And that's he is a child of the Gilded Age of the 19th century, of the end of that Victorian era. And he brings that sensibility, I think. But this sense of procession that you see in the landscape is also a sense of procession in the house, and I'm sure, he was mapping everything from, this is where we will have tea. This is where we will have cocktails. This is where we will, what we will process into dinner. And this is what will happen afterwards. And all that very constructed. It's hard to imagine it wasn't constructed down to the smallest detail because of how he created control over aesthetics of whatever it was that you were experiencing at Winterthur.
Yeah, and going off of that curation, and I'm veering a little off topic here, but because he also had, agriculture was important to him, there were lots of gardens. Was that part of the menu?
Oh, yes, I'm sure. Yes. I
Okay.
think you would 100% spend time, in the gardens. He had a golf course, so you would be golfing. I mean, all the entertainments that you
Yeah.
can imagine, but yes, outside time, of course. And you have to realize, I mean, he has a huge sense of pride in these gardens and accomplishment, and he would want people to experience them. I don't know that if you were a guest at Winterthur that you really got much chance to rest, because I think he probably kept you hopping the whole time. So yes, definitely the outdoors were part of it. And he had a lot of pride in the dairy. I personally have never read accounts of him bringing visitors, guests, like weekend guests to the dairy, which was obviously working. But I have
Mhm.
to did. When Jackie Kennedy visits, the visitor center is newly finished, and he cannot wait to show her the fabulous industrial kitchen that he's created in the visitor center, which was state of the art for the time. And she was thinking about how she would entertain at the White House. So she's looking at that. And
Wow.
so I think if you were a guest, he's showing you all of those things that he's proud of and that have been accomplished on the estate.
Yeah. Understanding, of course, that his connection to the land is so prominent and there's so much to that. I'd love to give you an opportunity to talk for a moment about what you have been a part of. There's an exhibit called Outside In. And so just the amount of information that's available because of how strong this connection is that you're able to even put something together like this.
Yes. So during closure in 2020, there were several things that kind of came together. The idea of nature and the decorative arts had, and always been, I mean, it's been something long talked about. It's not a unique concept, but we had started to think about this idea of HF and originally thinking about it inside out, outside in, and so this link between the interiors and the outside and vice versa. And at the time during closure early days, I was reading a wonderful book by Ruth Lord DuPont, HF's daughter. It's called HF DuPont and Winterthur, A Daughter's Portrait. I had read it years ago, but now being at that point back at Winterthur, actually less than a year at that point, and going back to it and reading about her description of HF's childhood in nature
Mm.
really jogged my mind and made me think of him differently and made me think of him as a collector of nature before he was a collector of objects. At the same time, the Delaware Museum of Natural History, which has different name now, was going to be closed for renovations, and they had all these collections that they needed to house. And our curator of exhibitions, Kim Collison, was meeting with their exhibits person and talking about this. And I remember being on my kitchen table and talking to her. And I'm reading this book, and I said, "Well, what about we bring these natural history objects into the gallery?" Because I've been reading about him collecting birds' nests and elements from nature, especially as a child. And so what initially was thought of as a really small exhibit inside out, outside in, evolved with a team of people and became Outside In, which is in our galleries now and opened in 21. And it really is this exploration of the influence of the landscape on HF inside the house and in his collecting. It is full of such beautiful, amazing objects. So things that we've talked about today, things like window hangings, things like tortoise shells, these all influenced his collecting. He was actually a very accomplished and competitive shell collector
Was he
during his
really?
lifetime. Yes,
Wow.
yes. And in his house in Florida, he actually integrated his shell collections in the design. So we looked at shells in the collection. So we had shells similar to ones he had collected, but then we went through the collection and we looked at all these other shell objects he had collected. So that show is up. It's such a beautiful window, I think, into him, into collecting at Winterthur. I think it's an opportunity to think about the aesthetics of Winterthur and the role that nature played in it. We had two fellows were at Winterthur at the time who were creating music. And so there's music in the galleries that actually has overlaid with the sounds of nature, playing with music that is music in the archives. So we brought all these elements together. We drew on the huge collection of estate records to put together this exhibit. To me, as the spring is here and the garden is blooming, and soon we'll have Azalea Woods is blooming and the March Bank is blooming now, you can go into this gallery and see how those things connect in to objects in the collection.
Mm-hmm.
And whether you see it first and then go into the house, or you see the house and then you go in, I think you will see Winterthur in a different light.
Well, that segues into one of the last questions I had for you, which is if there's anything that you hope folks take away from the harmony between the inside and the out.
I think just take the inspiration that you find in it, whether it's just the thought that maybe you would just put a cluster of the same flower in a vase, or whether you would go just cut some ivy, that you find growing and run it down your table, or maybe you would add a color that's outside into a room in your house. Maybe you don't take a swatch of fabric to pick a color. Maybe you take a leaf to pick a color. Little things like that. I think also thinking about looking out the window. So don't just design your inside, but think about what you're seeing outside in how you're thinking about your interiors, even if it's little things, even if it's just, integrating a pillow or a throw, do you have wonderful tulips that pop up in the spring, and maybe you put a yellow throw on your beige sofa because you have yellow tulips outside. I think it's that there's so much luxury at Winterthur because there was so much wealth to create it.
Mm-hmm.
But there's so many really beautiful ways to take Winterthur with you in small ways
Yes.
and in bigger ways. And certainly as a plug to our shop, I think that they are very aware of providing people a chance to take a little bit of Winterthur with, things for tablescaping, even, things at every price point that you can do. So to me, I think not saying, well, I'm not a DuPont. I don't have vast wealth, doesn't relate to me, but just find those little things that are really personal to you that just made you feel good. Even if you don't bring it back into your home, just consider that being around that beauty, whether you're paying attention to the details or not, but just being around that beauty gives you an ease, right?
Mm-hmm.
It gives you a peace. And I think Winterthur's a place where HF felt a lot of respite and peace. And that's what he hoped for in visitors, that they would have respite and peace on his estate. And so bring that sense into your home a little bit, that maybe it is a little touch that just sort of reminds you to pause in your interiors and think of them as a place, of respite, but think of the outside being part of that too.
I love that.
It's just the most amazing time of year because it's such an endless cycle of beauty on the estate that has had such an influence on how I think about Winterthur. If you're a garden person, maybe think about coming in, and we have people who just walk the garden and love it. But whether you start with the garden or you start with the inside, just think about the two being maybe more connected.
Alexandra, thank you so much for taking the time to be here. This was another super fun conversation, very insightful. And we were just kind of laughing that, we could talk for a million years, but thank you for giving us so much in an hour.
Thank you so much. I loved it. And I hope that it really inspires people to think about Winterthur kind of with a new lens. And I appreciate you giving us the chance to talk about this.